Let's start. We had a fuller panel this time around in the second part of the panel, and so we'll try to go faster. But I just wanted to say hello to everybody. Thank you for being here and engaging with our interests and playing with us and having the beautiful disposition that most of you have. I do want to say something, repeating some things for those of you who are new to the panel and were in the previous one, and then in an order that I was make some sense. The continent from south to north, rather than just to disrupt the play here, as topics are so different. And so thank you again, everybody, for being here and your interest in the panel. And thank you again, Mara and Aadita, who can join us right now because India is late at night, who are my accomplices in this endeavor, who committed to thinking the world otherwise, as my colleague Laura Meek and I have described it elsewhere. Commitment is constant. So I wanted to start our collective thinking by reminding why we revisiting what brings us together. We decided to call this STS from the wounds, a very generative idea, we think, standing on a feminist STS scaffolding and the call for unrolliness that for me and others characterizes it. As we were designing this panel, we wondered, what does it mean to engage in good relations in a world that unfolds after violence, extinction, displacement, and destruction? And the question that emerged was how STS responds to wounded wars. With these concerns, we wanted to investigate destruction and the vitality of destruction, but not in a non-universalist manner, but rather from a politics of what we're thinking as politics of wounded knowledges, ecologies of practices and geographies, and what the demands that they make. Again, we were taking inspiration from Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, who reject reparations as their wounds are ever changing, and also from, for instance, extractive practices in Colombia, and the ever killing of, or the systematic killing of those who organize alternative modes of being with nature. Importantly here for us is that we wanted to think about how to politicize and maybe the politics of making lines, borders, territories, the traces or the croquis of what is wounded, and do a deep thinking of what that means. And so today we'll see 4 different, very diverse papers that all speak of wounds and wounded and wounding worlds. They all speak of limit, excesses, of destruction, many, and of their traces and their politics. We hope that we all find it very lively and generative conversation, of course, and we do want to share that we envision making this into an edited volume in which we can keep thinking about what the wound can be and what it means for many of us. And so again, the invitation, I think, and it's a playful one, is to go from the continent from south to north. And so that will be Oriana, you first. Thank you so much.
Can you see the screen now? Okay, so I will start. Thank you, Julia, for the presentation. So in the past years, I've been part of an interdisciplinary research team, and we have conducted a number of genealogies of sociomaterial devices to examine how societies come to terms with human rights atrocities in the context of the Cold War of the 70s and 80s in Latin America. As you know, this was an ideological project oriented at the extermination of socialism, communism, and contra-insurgent movements from Mexico to Chile. The target was the enemy within, the subversive subject, as Pinochet, or in his own words. So based on archival work, and hopefully complemented with interviews in the coming months after the lockdown, I'm going to talk now about an ongoing research. So just to show you where we are after. So it's a pretty much open discussion this time. And in this research, we have taken as the object of examination massive raids, or allanamientos in Spanish, which is a form of state violence based on the control, discipline, and subordination of territories, which are considered a threat. So unlike other forms of state violence we have studied, in Chile, massive raids have been practiced for 5 decades, so under the dictatorship and in the democratic regime. So we can think of it as a policy of territorial asepsis, morphing, in these 5 decades from a form of political violence during the dictatorial regime, to something that is part of the political economy of neoliberalism. So from political violence to extractivism. So in this case, there is no reparation, no official recognition of this form of political violence during the regime, and obviously not during this democratic epoch in which we are now. So I'll give you some glimpses of this complex genealogy. And the approach also we are trying to follow to examine this form of violence, and we'll finish with some questions we are trying to address. So in our archival work so far, we concentrated in these 2 periods during the dictatorship, and we have found, well, this number of massive raids. We just focus on massive raids, although there are other types of raids, more like specific to houses or to political organizations or professional organizations, etc. More than 100 settlements are have been the target of these raids, and in 6 regions. And I want to show you, if it works, please let me know, this video now. Okay, hopefully you, you could follow it. So this is the kind of race that the dictatorship used to do in to produce terror and dismantle the social and political organization of the urban poor. As you see, I'm going to explain you now. This is a collective movement organized around survival strategies, including the seizure of land for urban settlement that began in the 60s. It's a movement with a strong identity, obviously based on this territorial and marginal position, but also on cultural and political communitarian practices that were not governed by the states. So that's where they were dangerous. And they, for example, I'm going to show you just an example. This is seizure of a land, vacant lot that belonged to the University of Chile. And it's the moment where 100 families took this land to perform the right to a proper housing like any other human being. They tried to achieve this by different means, knocking a number of doors, but by the end they just seized the land. And they said this is 1980, so in the middle of the dictatorship, after Pinochet approved a new constitution, and that means that he would be in power for 8 more years. They said, this is our first triumph during this regime. We've got the land. This is a political issue. And on the response of the government through the mayor of Santiago, appointed by the dictatorship, was, I will investigate where this initiative was born, why it occurred, and who organized it. I'm going to show who the instigators were. Obviously, he was trying to chase communists and priests among them. 4 years later, in November 1984, you have the same dwelling with a massive raid. This is a drawing from one of the dwellers of this poblacion. It's a joint operation by the army, the air forces, the police, the investigation, and the intelligence agency, with 7,000 armed men, 3 helicopters, tanks, to try to control 200 civilians, and it would take from 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. That's the very typical form they were deployed, these massive raids, operating in the habitat and in the daily intimacy of family life, and in many cases forcing them to abandon their homes in the early morning. It's violating the private space, their houses, now entering, destroying everything around. It involves the temporary detention of men, and in some cases it led to other forms of violence, such as imprisonment, torture, relegation, execution, and disappearance. These practices faced, even in dictatorship, popular resistance, and here this is one of the pamphlets they produce, and you can see in the event of raids and arrests, the entire population must take a defense action because it is a duty of the dwellers defend the place where they live. And they would then, in this story, three years later, there would be these massive eradications, which shows that if you want, the biopolitics of the dictatorship not only exhibits concentration and death camps where opponents were exterminated, but also large columns of poor people being thrown to the urban margins. And you can see here the trucks with the belongings of these people. So central to this policy was the reconfiguration of their sociality, and this occurred through the modification and of their space of living, their atomization, this distribution of them throughout the city, and also try to reorganize these dwellers so their demands can be managed again by the local council or by other organizations already divorced from the left wing, and with actually the penetration of the right-wing parties. And here is our democratic period from 1990 to these days. And in post-dictatorship, massive raids have been justified first as anti-drugs operations, and in the past years, they have moved here in the south, where the dot is, to the Mapuche communities in South Chile, representing attempts at governing a territory in the face of the extractive needs of the forest industry and the ancestral demands for autonomy and territory of these people, impoverished by the state since colonial times. In this map, you can see how in yellow, the distribution of the indigenous, of the Mapuche's land communities, and in green from 1994 to 2003, the spread of the forest industry, and so you can have an image of the geopolitics behind these massive raids. So it's about expropriating a territory for economic exploitation, and here the dispossession is carried out and generates effects on an entire ecosystem, including earth beings, the land, the water, the forest, the mountains, the ancestral property structures, the indigenous culture, the community life, and the maintenance of ethnic identities and the ecological sustainability of these territories. So to sum up, we are trying to understand these 5 decades and how what are the effects of the performativity of this technology of political and economic dispossession that works in terms of specialized occupation, in terms of the ubiquity, of this visuality, this intimidation with this fluid target. In this regime of extended visibility, and how physical space is mapped onto a form of dispossessed being, aimed at the subjugation of if you want, anti-capitalist form of life. First, the poblador, the dweller, now the indigenous communities. So the question is how to address this lasting form of neoliberal governance, how to trace its wounds in terms of this panel. And to do this, we have to go beyond the victim paradigm, which is quite hegemonic in the field of human rights, as it's, as you know, it's inspiring political theories and legal forensic frameworks, and it's part of this governmental reason. And it's based on this human condition, and it's associated to the traumatic events and singular entities that already acted by violence. And this proves difficult when you try to understand the ideological struggle of which this is an effect. And usually it's an approach that understands the subject of violence as someone devoid of agency and politics, and obviously ignores resistance. And also we are thinking of how to build a framework of post-human human rights, acknowledging that human rights is a biopolitical assemblage helping to perform liberal democracies while reinforcing racism, colonialism, and anthropocentrism. And we agree here with Povinelli in terms to try to resist biopolitical governance as research as well. We had to decenter the self-identical substance in which it currently dwells. And the question is how to think of this form of governance without an ontology of the self-identical and the self-enclosing being, how to deploy a post-human interspecies approach to this kind of abuses. And so we're working with this idea of ontopology that helps us to understand the ontological value of beings, of all type of beings, in their connection with their territories, with their soul, with their bodies. thinking of massive raids as forms of dispossession, attempting to govern, to inscribe, to produce territories by marking them as dangerous, asking, trying to examine and try to politicize also the marks that borders, divides make upon these wounded ontopologies to explore the capacity of resistance and of reordering the world that violence and dispossession instantiate as well. And we leave you with these kind of the questions we are trying to address. What are the devices that perform these ontopologies in this number of years? What counts as evidence? How is truth mobilized? And what knowledge, technologies, infrastructures, and entities sustain or even morph to sustain these ontopologies? What are the costs involved, which wounds are there as traces of these politics, which traces also we cannot find anymore. And finally, who these wounded subjects are, that's probably our main question in this research. So thank you very much. I will leave you there.
So much, Oriana. I think we have to move forward, but I think there's a lot to think about temporality here.
Sure.
Okay, so Liliana and Óscar.
Share my screen.
Good afternoon, everybody there. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting us to join. Thank you.
Aquí. Now you can see it?
Yes.
Okay. So, Oscar, you want to begin?
Yeah, why not? So, our is called Materiality and Deceiving, handcrafted landmines in the Colombian War. Okay, Liliana, that she's now a lecturer at the Arizona University, and me that I'm working right now with the Javeriana University. So we are working about the materiality of war, and then about a concept that we are trying to work on in collective cunning. So if you want to start, Liliana, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Julia, and for this panel and all the reflections you mentioned. I hope to give some ideas about it. Well, first, we are going to talk about handcrafted materiality and deceiving. So first, we are going to talk about FARC guerrilla. So FARC was the most long-lasting guerrilla in the world. They signed the peace agreement with the national government, Colombian government, in 2016. And but when they were at its peak, like in 2000s or at the end of 1990s, they had like 200,000 combatants, and this was the structure. They had blocks in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the borders with Venezuela and Ecuador, and the most important blocks or units, military units, were Eastern Bloc and the Southern Bloc. They followed what is called a popular warfare strategy. So in this kind of strategic approach, they use what is called attritional warfare, trying to balance the armed power of the state. So they use this idea of attrition, and in order to do that, they use landmines, and the kind of landmines they use are artisanal kind of landmines. So at the right, you have the contamination map of landmines in Colombia. Is the red spots here. are all the landmines that are, if you are familiar with maps, they are overlaid in a particular hotspots, very biodiverse, as natural parks, but also forest areas, and they follow patterns of a specific or interest, like strategic assets or specific areas like the borders with Venezuela, but also Ecuador. So this is like the framework of our analysis. They use this landmines, and we are going to see that we are going to talk about materiality. Um, these are the kind of mines we have in Colombia. Some are like not this tiny but dangerous, but like it could be bigger. And mines are fabricated by different kind of materials. They are ordinary kind of materials as light bulbs, but also plastic or motorcycle chains, to use it as a powerful kind of cutting, if I can say it in some way. So materiality of landmines in Colombia is a process of assembling. I really like what Freddy Mora mentioned about crafting and recrafting of some materials that at some point are reused, and reconverting it in new and used materials to create new artifacts. And these artifacts engage, as Julia mentioned in the outline of our panel, that are engaging good relation within landscapes of war. And these landscapes, as some of you have mentioned, are go beyond material and human, are more than human, as Latour mentioned, and are intertwined within specific ecologies. And that's why, for instance, this kind of material here at the right, at the bottom, is pine wax. So depending on which area the mines are installed and prepared, they adapted and just mixed and meshed into the particularities of these ecologies. So through artifacts and its materiality, STS help us to reorganize not only material but also sensible world, world of world of war. And the artifact allow us to see or to engage this sensitivity, but also materiality. I want just to mention this, and if you can see this one, so the particularities of the soil, but also if you have it like in the trees or in particular areas, are thought not only as a material aspect, but also as a deceiving one, in order to the effectiveness of this kind of weapons is not only the technical systems, but also to be camouflaged in the areas that they are installed. So I think with that, I give you the floor, Oscar.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Besides the materiality, that is an amazing topic to talk about. We have this concept we are trying to characterize, that is collective cunning. We generally define it as the shared ability to assemble, enhance, or use proximal materials, knowledge, or technologies. Um, it is the tactical intelligence stuck to any innovation process. In war context, could be this cunning more acute due to the need to survive and the extreme geographies or the relationships with the enemy. What we have in here is several use to characterize the forms of local knowledge innovation, in illegality. And for example, we have the dyad explicit and tacit knowledge. It was first Polanyi for the field of psychology, but then author Senker or Mackenzie and Spinardi broke them the dyad, the explicit and tacit knowledge to war, to understand processes of war. So that, yeah, tacit and explicit knowledge are the most well-known concepts. We have more, like for example, this one, techne and metis. Um, they are used in this famous book from Pablo to Osama by Michael Kinney, and he took them both from scoffed from another American author, and this metis concept is defined as a form of crafty intelligence that bears on fluid situations which are constantly changing. And of course, we have more. We have the indie word for innovative or an improvised solution born from ingenuity and cleverness, that is juha. Um, um, this one, the malevolent creativity, um, conceptualized by Cropley uh, in the UK. They say that is a type of creativity that is planned to damage others, typically seen in time of war. We have the another one that is the Chinese word that highlights the non-mainstream products or the replicas of popular brands where inventiveness and rebellion are mixed to compete with global corporations. Uh, inventiveness by necessity, and there is a uh, ba va used by Nonaka in the 1990s. Describe it like knowledge spaces where cognitive facets and concrete craft skills dimensions merge. The I think it's not in the presentation, but there are more. What we are trying to do now is kind of a lead review about this local knowledge, local type of innovation, um, just next to the material problem. I think both, like the material and the cunning, are mixed in the war itself. So that's where what we are trying to work now.
One thing to add is that, and following the conversation of the panel, is that landmines could be the ruins and the wounds of war, and also the the idea we had with Oscar is also that tracking the collective cunning and also knowing better territories and also knowing better strategies and mixing and crafting and crafting of materials, we can understand better the wounds of war that for us could be seen as these artifacts that are spread out all over the 31 out of the 32 departments of Colombia. So with this in mind, we had an, a good amount of information that should be tracked in order to know better this these wounds of war that now that we are in a post-conflict situation, still they affect, especially after the peace agreement, they affect especially civilians and not military personnel, because people are returning to the areas where they were displaced. So we hope to contribute with this idea, and we are based in our two PhD thesis on Óscar sites. It was the military and health innovations in clandestine warfare settings, the technical specialization and collective resourcefulness in the FARC-EP. For me, my thesis was about landmine landscapes in the Colombian Amazon, the social, environmental, and technological life of artifacts. That is all on our end.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Óscar, si quieres
much.
decir, me dices.
Oscar, ¿vas a decir?
No.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much,
La
Liliana y
discusión.
Oscar. Yeah. For you both know that I'm this is my jam. But thank you so much. And I think there's a lot for us to think about. Time making wounds, how something lasts in the landscape. And it's part of what you're saying when you're talking about the nature of the device, right? What happens to it in the engagement with time and the landscape. Okay, so next, make of Dana, however you prefer to go. Meg, you're there. Okay, go ahead, Meg. Because you're in Mexico. You're working on Mexico.
Yeah, U.S. Mexico Borderlands.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Meg, again for being here.
Oh, of course. Oops, let's see. It's the wrong. One moment. There we go. Can you see my slides now? You can. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
So my name is Meg Perret, and I'm a candidate at Harvard History of Science. This talk is about my work on the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. This talk analyzes an emerging coalition of immigrants, scientists, conservationists, activists, and artists who imagine the future of human migrant groups as inextricable from the preservation of biodiversity in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. I completed analysis of scientific, political, and cultural discourse about the border wall in between 2005 and 2020, and conducted 6 oral histories with biodiversity scientists working in the region. In this talk, I demonstrate that this emerging coalition's political vision for the environmental future of the borderlands hinges on analogizing cultural and biological diversity. In 2005, Congress passed the Real ID Act, which authorized the Department of Homeland Security to waive all legal restrictions in order to expedite the construction of border barriers as part of Bush's war on terror. Days after taking office in 2017, Trump issued an executive order to begin construction of a continuous border barrier. The Department of Homeland Security used the legal waiver granted by the Real ID Act to bypass more than 40 environmental and human rights protections, such as the Endangered Species Act and Native American Religious Freedom Act. The irony is that the wall only slows people illegally immigrating by an average of 5 minutes. This alarmed conservationists because the borderlands is a biodiversity hotspot that supports many endangered species found nowhere else in the world. This image is from protests organized by the Center for Biological Diversity and the Sierra Club in partnership with local people to protest the border wall. The protesters employ visual rhetoric that uses endangered species such as the jaguar as symbols of the broader threat of border militarization to both human and non-human communities. While alt-right political discourse posed white America as a, quote, endangered species due to Latino immigration, close quote, conservation biologists and field ecologists have been outspoken that Trump's wall is itself environmentally disastrous. A 2018 Bioscience article titled Nature Divided, Scientists United finds that the border wall would doom over 94 endangered species to extinction. As the result of binational collaboration, the paper has nearly 3,000 signatories of scientists in Mexico, the US, and elsewhere. As a lead author of the article, Dr. Robert Peters, a senior scientist at Defenders of Wildlife, told me that for conservation biologists, the border wall symbolizes the broader threat of habitat fragmentation, which could be the leading cause of species extinction. Habitat fragmentation isolates populations, restricts gene flow, and makes endangered species more susceptible to extinction. Top predators that require large range sizes in the American Southwest would be cut off from populations in Mexico. Many of these species, such as the jaguar, will go extinct if the border wall is completed. Border militarization also degrades local habitat through noise pollution, human foot traffic, and the off-roading of Border Patrol vehicles. These threats are exacerbated by climate change that causes regional droughts and shifts species ranges. Border militarization has also directly hampered biodiversity science. Conservationist Sergio Villa told me that he experienced racial profiling while researching jaguar conservation in the border. Border Patrol would continually harass him, impede his crossing of the border, and interfere with his ability to conduct his research. He was even held at gunpoint by Border Patrol agent despite providing documentation of his education and employment as a conservation biologist. He left the scientific research community out of fear for his life. In his current job at the Sierra Club, he educates the public about the seasonal migration of monarch butterflies from Mexico through the US to Canada. Avia analogizes butterfly and human migration through naturalizing rhetoric. He says, quote, "Migration is a natural process and the border wall is an unnatural barrier." Visual artist Lauren Strohacker created a public art installation at the border wall titled Unfragmenting Desfragmentado. The digital art projection overlaid larger-than-life images of borderland species on the bars of the border fence. The images are from motion-triggered cameras belonging to the conservation group the Northern Jaguar Project. As a community engagement artist, Strohacker projected the wildlife images simultaneously on both sides of the border fence in collaboration with the residents of the cities of Agua Prieta and Douglas. The fragmentation of the images by the surface of the border wall symbolizes the literal fragmentation of animal populations from border wall construction. Conservation photographer Krista Schuyler depicts the diversity of people and wildlife in the US-Mexico borderlands. Contrary to media representations that depict the borderlands as a militarized wasteland, her photography depicts the beauty, tenacity, and inventiveness of borderlands inhabitants. Her most popular image captures the moment in which animals and humans are directly limited by the border fence, thereby showcasing the reality of habitat fragmentation. Her 2019 documentary film, Ay Mariposa, depicts the migration of monarch butterflies alongside women activists fighting for environmental and social justice. The film highlights the journey of Zuelma Hernandez as she migrates from Mexico to the US.
A mí siempre me ha encantado la naturaleza, especialmente las mariposas, porque a mí me gustaría estar tan libre como ellas.
The film creates a parallel narrative structure that juxtaposes the life cycle of monarchs as they transform from caterpillars to butterflies and the personal transformation of this migrant woman as she becomes an advocate for her community of migrant workers. In doing so, the film creates a metaphorical structure that compares the journey of monarch butterflies from Mexico to Canada to the movement of immigrants across the US-Mexico border. The film also documents the efforts of women conservationists to halt the construction of the border wall through the National Butterfly Wildlife Center in Texas, which is crucial habitat for endangered butterflies. Latinx activist, artist, and storyteller Fabiana Rodriguez drew a series of protest posters titled "Migration is Beautiful" that uses images of monarch butterflies to demonstrate that movement with the seasons is inevitable and natural. Her images depict the figures of women within the butterfly's wings. For Rodriguez, analogizing animal and human migration is an accessible means to reimagine borders as permeable rather than militarized. Employing naturalizing rhetoric, she writes, quote, "We belong to nature and nature has no borders," end quote. Since then, the butterfly has emerged as an international symbol of migrant rights. Rodriguez has collaborated with queer artist Julio Salgado. He depicts himself as a butterfly with bilingual text on the wings. The image draws on cultural connotations between butterflies and queerness in Mexican American communities. The word for butterfly in Spanish, mariposa, is slang for gay men. The image has become an icon of the undocuqueer movement of queer youth or dreamers in the US. Jessex Snow is a queer migrant Asian American artist whose protest posters titled "Migration is Natural" depicts migrant and animals crossing the US-Mexico borderlands. Her artwork went viral in 2017 as part of the hashtag #NoBanNoWall social media campaign against Trump's construction of the border wall. Her artwork employs aesthetic slippages between migrant and human bodies to depict the circular, natural, and ancient interdependency of human and animal migration across the artificial borders of nations. In the image on the right, she depicts queer interracial lovers entwined in an embrace, surrounded by butterflies, hummingbirds, and constellations. The butterflies and birds spill over from one person to the other at places where their bodies meet. A stream of butterflies and birds fly downward over the border wall as if they are messengers of a new world without borders. Snow's work is provocative because she analogizes sexual and biological diversity in order to subvert narratives of the supposed unnaturalness of queer sexualities. In conclusion, scientists, conservationists, activists, and artists use endangered migratory species such as jaguars and monarchs as emblems of resistance against border wall construction. Scholars in Latinx environmentalisms argue that art, activism, and culture can bring about new decolonial environmental imaginaries and thus enable new futures for people in the environment. Through analogizing endangered species and human migrants, these representations provide a distinctive political vision for the environmental future of the borderlands, in which human and non-human communities flourish together beyond the historical wounds of borders and binaries. Yet, this visual rhetoric is itself politically risky. Historically, comparisons between animals and marginalized human groups, such as migrants and sexual minorities, has been used as justification for the oppression, colonialization, and dehumanization of these communities. It remains to be seen if reconceptualizing the increasingly fragmented borderlands in terms of entangled relationalities of care and interdependency will contribute to multi-species environmental justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. So interesting. Okay, Dana, let's go, and then we'll have some time to make questions for everybody and have a lovely conversation.
Thank you. I have so much going on in my head right now. I don't even know if I want to talk about my research. I want to talk about all these things. I'll try and be somewhat brief. I have a doc here for accessibility purposes, which more or less contains what I think I will talk about. I live and work on the ancestral lands of the Cahuilla, Tongva, Serrano, and Luiseño peoples. My institution, the University of California, was founded as a land-grant university with the proceeds of native lands. That's where I'm coming from. And I just want to express my thanks to the organizers, not only for the infrastructural work, but also kinds of infrastructural work, including the invitation to think about temporality. And reading the abstract and thinking about what to talk about, that really struck me as sort of thinking about what happens after wounds, physical and temporal displacements. And so I want to sort of play with that and think hunger, which is the topic of my research, about hunger, time, and wounds. So my current research studies the embeddedness of hunger in 20th century experimental education science, post-war international governance, neuroscience, and addiction science. And I want to say that there's a sort of experimental exuberance, to quote Michelle Murphy, that proliferated around hunger in the 20th century. And that has led me to want to argue that hunger is produced and continues to be produced actively, purposefully, and systematically. And my research focus is mostly the United States. And the second part of the claim or thing that I'm thinking about, which is connected to the organizer's invitation, is to think about how hunger expert and expertise have severed hunger from history. So I've been struggling as I work on this project to figure out how to write a history of both the science of hunger and the politics of hunger and welfare. They appear so disconnected. I really struggle to build convincing ties between, the dispossession or say the starvation of native peoples and the regime of education that arises around it. And at some point, I realized that's not just my fault, that this severing is actually part of the history. There's a resistance to situating hunger present and within actually existing society. It's always deferred, shifted away from the present, either deferred to the deep past or contained in a kind of punctual instance of crisis, or tied to an anticipatory future. And each of these aligns how hungry presents are actively produced. So I wanted just to give 4 examples, 4 modes of temporalizing hunger and the violence of hunger. The first is crisis temporality. And that has been very much apparent over the course of the pandemic. And instead of slides, I'm throwing in these links. I hope that works. So is to announcement by the executive director of the World Food Program, the United Nations, warning that hunger is a second pandemic. So this is from April 2020. He said, at the same time, while dealing with a COVID-19 pandemic, brink of a hunger pandemic due to the coronavirus. An additional 130 people could be pushed to the brink of starvation by the end of 2020. So that, and we've seen, many versions of crisis imagery around hunger in the pandemic, contained within the sphere of the pandemic. Then an example of what I might call a primordial temporality. This is the United Nations Zero Hunger Challenge, which seeks to end hunger, to eliminate all forms of malnutrition by 2030. This is just the latest version of a number of UN sponsored or food aid type campaigns that set as their goal to eliminate hunger, to end hunger, to end undernutrition. And what really strikes me about this kind of temporality is the assumption that somehow hunger and malnutrition are relics of the past, are something that has been produced and is no longer being produced, and therefore can be sort of drawn down, you know, like an like exchanging an old kind of currency. That, you know, that is no longer being produced, but will gradually be eliminated. One more form of temporality is evolutionary, is connected to what's known as the mismatch theory. And this is another form of this sort of placing hunger in the past, but here this is the deep past, the evolutionary past, in which hunger is fundamental to the very constitution of life. It's a genetic response to prehistoric. And the reason why there are metabolic diseases such as obesity or any form of malnutrition, undernutrition, is because modern humans are maladapted. Our bodies are adapted, and we're trying to live in a modern world for which we are maladapted. So that's the mismatches between the genetic constitution of human bodies and environment. And the popular variants of this are things like the paleo diet, you know, to sort of eat like your ancestors, right? And that comes actually directly out of thinking of Sanad, a whole tradition of biological anthropology, of which the example I put in the latest version that popped up, that's mainly focused on studying hunter-gatherer peoples and their as a sort of as a form of survival of anthropology, you know, sort of no, not survival anthropology. The word will come back to me. And a form of anthropology that's destined to try and preserve before they disappear. So that's another form of temporality. And then there's one, and I want to recognize also while I'm talking about that, the work by many 4S members, including Emily Yates-Dorr, Alicia Galvez, Natalie Valdez, and Megan Warren, to push back against some of these genetic determinist theories of metabolic disease. Because the corollary of this is that some bodies are less adapted to modernity than others. And in particular, indigenous bodies are marked as less adapted to modernity than others, are likely to suffer from metabolic disease. There's one more form of chronicity that I want to talk about, or temporality, that I want to share, which is the model of or predictive homeostasis, which imagines that anticipatory response that's based on past experience. So past stresses, in particular, this comes out very much out of a tradition of research around stresses build up in the body, and hormonal levels response to that, neurosignals adjust, and this leads to anticipatory cravings for things like salt or fat, so that the body itself is primed by past experience and by past violence to respond to with stronger hunger, to signal, you know, a need for carbohydrates, a need for salt. So these were examples of temporality around hunger, and trying to think with them, and I guess I should just mention too, I'm still trying to figure out the chronicity of hunger and COVID, which is really strange and interesting, because the crisis model of hunger doesn't actually reflect the data around food insecurity, which seems to indicate that the amount of hunger in 2020 shifted, but was largely within what is quote unquote normal. So how does one think about a crisis that doesn't resolve itself? So these temporalities open or foreclose different thinking, different ways of thinking. Hunger. Hunger is not primordial, it's not an art of some pre-modern past. It's not out of time and place. It is, Marx in fact identified the production of hunger as a primary mode of primitive accumulation. That is, you starve colonized peoples into participating in wage labor. And I want to just mark two key moments in the United States where I noticed sort of active and focused severing of hunger from history, or the dehistoricization of hunger. The first is in the late 19th century. Hunger is integrated into experimental psychology, right as starvation is being used to clear the land for settler colonization of North America. So right at the moment when hunger and starvation were mobilized programmatically to displace indigenous peoples from lands to be occupied by settlers, hunger was being folded into an experimental program of psychology and naturalized in that sense. The second moment that I've noted is in the 1960s, which is in the context of the genocidal campaign of ethnic cleansing in the American South through starvation. And that moment is often recognized as sort of the moment when hunger became visible in the United States in the 1960s. In both popular media and expert descriptions, this starvation appeared out of time. In the South, just seemed to look like that. There was not a sense that this might be something new or specific to a particular moment in the evolution of the Southern agricultural economy. So I'm just thinking about what is this, how to deal with the temporalities, the multiple temporalities of hunger, and the way in which violence itself seems to slip away in all of these different temporal forms. I've thought about, been thinking with Rod Nixon's notion of slow violence, or Lauren Berlant's description of obesity as a form of slow death. But I think that in some ways trying to describe this as slow blocks an adequate temporalization of hunger as violence. I don't think this is not slow. It's deferred. The temporality itself is a site of violence. And I still don't know exactly how to get at that. And so I guess maybe I would just end with something that really, the previous panel's presentation brought home to me, which is thinking about what to do with sort of the despair that a researcher encounters, right, in trying to reckon with these multiple displacements, and how to position oneself, how to position a project that's sort of fix a historical account without reproducing the same dynamic once again. So maybe to sort of echo or signal to Mara's provocation around how considering these histories forces us to think about our own our own positionality as researchers within the very process, and the fair as method. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dana, as always. Let's open the floor for questions and concerns, comments, rather than concerns. I saw there's plenty of those in the side chat, so maybe we can go to them. Again, I think a provocation that is arising is time and temporality in relation to wounded landscapes, wounded worlds, and I wouldn't say the fragility, but just the fragility and also the strength that comes out of them and that is made through them. I was thinking about time, and as Oriana started, it seemed to me there's something happening with allanamientos, right? The raids. They're not the same. They're without a doubt not the same. But right, it's not the same to the 1970s and 80s as the Mapuche now. But nonetheless, and it's beyond the figure of terror, right? It's beyond the figure of terror of the raid. Although it's built on the figure of the terror of the raid, of the fear that the raid brings to it, and the history that the raid brings to it, and the dispossession that the raid brings with it. But I think, I don't know, I was just keep thinking about, there's something happening with time here. Also, like, raids take time. You know that they're gonna, like, somebody's always telling you, when if you were in the left 40 years ago, somebody will call and say they're gonna allanar your house, and so you have to run, and people were alerted to this, right? And now the police or the state is not innocent in their deployment of the tactic, and so people know that the dispossession is coming. And so I don't know. It's a confusing comment, but I think it's something there about how time is used. Or it's interesting in terms of time, and also like thinking about the landmines. Thinking about the landmines was also then thinking about landmines. Time emerged as and it's not that time is, yeah. The pass of time is complicated in these scenarios.
So I don't know what happened. I don't know if you also want to make questions to each other, take the space.
Well, I will begin to break the ice. There is a saying, or not a saying, there is a concept from, ay, no me acuerdo cómo se llama ahora. There is no landscape, but Tim Ingold. Tim Ingold mentioned that when you refer to the pass of time, referring to landscape, he talked about the concept that is taskscape. And with that idea, and referring to landmines, what you have now as wounds, it's the reflection of the past. I think, Oriana, you have the mic unmuted, and I think it just sounds a little bit. Thanks. And when you see from the ones from now to the past, that is our proposal with Óscar, you can track patterns, spaces, locations, strategic assets that were guarded at that time. And you have the idea of the temporality of landscape regarding to landmines as something that passed in the past, and you are gathering information in order to demine. But now what we have, it's a new challenge because now things are changing and you have new challenges. We don't even know what has happened and where the mines are. And now we have the challenge to forecast where not only the mines that existed, but the ones that are created now in the new spiral of violence. So you have like temporalities intertwining in the same floor. And I think that could be a reflection on my end, just to break the ice and open the conversation.
I will jump just with two remarks. And thank you all for this diverse panel. I really enjoyed it. Well, I think it's difficult to think about time or temporalities without space, and like in the mine case as well, and mine in the allanamientos, it's a way of governing time and space at the same time. And even in the case of the raids, the way it works is that you will fear to be raid, and that fear is also, a form of discipline. It's just not the raid itself, but the fear of being. So just how it works in if you wanted the time of and space of your imagination, of the possible, and it's part of the power of this forms of political violence, and even if it's a form of torture, if you want. And the other thing I was we can bring to the conversation, and probably comes from the memory studies, is the question of this past that doesn't pass. We probably are dealing with in the case of Colombia in many ways. This violence that we cannot leave behind is never ending. It's there. So it's a kind of temporality that we try to move to behind, to leave behind, but it's always coming back in some ways. So a time that doesn't pass, something like that. Thank you.
Somebody else have questions? Because I do have questions, but I don't want to
I've got one, which is related to your concern about temporality, which is, and also to Mara's question of the first section, is how we deal with the traces in this case of these wounded worlds, and the role time plays in finding those traces as researchers. And when you are far away in time or space from the event, how to find traces, and how to conduct research when those traces are not longer there.
Precisely because Oriana and I work on forensic science, as many of you know here, and so that's why I guess on that. I will keep going to that, right? To what time does, to all these lines and excesses at times that we're describing, and what happens to them. Yeah.
I wanted to wanted to know, I think Mara's approach is really interesting for that reason. In so displacing the scene, it's almost as though there's a parallel research process that's unfolding through thinking about the beaver. There's so much more. There's so many more traces that are embedded, or not even embedded, that are ghosts. I guess ghostly traces is the right word, the word that you use. And that actually made me think. Part of what I try to do with projects, with my current project, is to study laboratory hunger as an archive of hunger, to understand the history of hunger through tracing what's going on in laboratories and the ways in which hunger is mobilized by scientists. But it's very, and I readers and sometimes myself have a really difficult time like grasping, because these things have been severed. Like, all I can do is like make analogical gestures,
Yeah, and sever like wounds do, right? That's something that wounds do. They sever, right? And that's part of their action, the constant action.
Julia, sorry, they
Sever. Como te arrancan.
Can you say it in Spanish?
Te arrancan.
Te
Como que
arrancan.
te quita te cortan.
Thank you.
They do that, right? And doing that, totally agreeing with you, Dina, and that is part of what is going on fundamentally here.
But could I actually, I mean, drawing on that, I would love to ask you, because I think in some ways that's connected with this sort of the affect of the researcher, right? Of sort of the despair of the researcher, right? To never actually be able to never to be adequate. We're never adequate. So what to do with that? I really, it's really at many points has just blocked me. I'd love to hear from others how the affect of how you work through this.
But yes, and isn't a recognition of the experimental nature of a lot of what we do, especially in a place like an STS environment, which is what we do. Sometimes I think that highlights it. Like in my own presentations in this conference, I say this is experimental. As a way to recognizing that concepts are always insufficient, but not necessarily always in excess. And they account for, right? They're making a game. They're playing the part of engaging with the worlds that we want to. Oh no, engaging with the fact that we want to be providing accounts of the world, of the many worlds. Maybe, right? And from many different interstice spaces and liminality spaces, and the margin and the center. And so for me, it has been useful to recognize playfulness and experimental nature of the work.
I would like to mention something
Oh,
that
go ahead.
maybe connect us with Oriana and our analysis on landmines. And I think one of the ideas that or levels is also political, and I think at macro level we are saying, for instance, landmines within the political environment mean a dispute between powers, some guerrillas and the government. What I seen about raids is also that, but these are like causes, or not causes but result of a macro macro framework, if I can say it, at some point related to, at that point, Cold War. And uh, and I think that we are seeing all the results there in the floor. But at some point, when we analyze what are the big powers. I think it's not only related to colonialism or just disputes that we see today, but also the framework is bigger than that, for instance. And when we just talk about guerrilla in some specific frame, but we are going to analyze the when they began to use it in 60s and in 60s, all Latin American guerrillas follow some ideas, and that um, uh, at some point were like a bad and good, and two ways where political power were reflected specifically in our countries. So I don't know if at some point, and I just wanted to ask about for Oriana in the rates, we see now that as the past that we see in Chile, but if you have analyzed like in a bigger framework about political dispute at that point, because it was the dictatorship at that time that caused that see an enemy, and you mentioned an insider enemy. So if you have analyzed that in a bigger perspective, or just I'm not saying that it's not enough. I just want to say, if you see the big register, like for instance, for us, it is Cold War, and it continues for a long time and go beyond the Cold War. But we haven't discussed that in this point, and I was just bracket an idea also related to hunger, and it's Stalinist period in Russia, where starvation, hunger, and the death of thousands of Russians because of starvation, it was also a key point. So I was thinking how hunger and how violence and how other biggest frameworks as political Cold War, and at that point frame all the war, and we are analyzing just like the results of that in our specific worlds. I don't know if it's too confusing, but I just want to give the floor to analyze in a bigger framework. It's a question for Oriana and for Dana. If you want to
Yeah, it's a big question. Well, yeah, we spent like, I don't know how many years, like 7 years, in a big research in Chile, but then we actually went to Colombia and Mexico. But just understanding how the role of documents and artifacts of registration of political violence have had in the way, we have been able to deal with state violence in the region. So that's the main. What I've done before, what I'm doing now is yeah. So that's what I've been using STS scholarship to bring it to the field of human rights, and to we have a lot of archives of human rights atrocities, but we try to study them in terms of the way, well, in a sort of infrastructural approach, and trying to go through these archives and see, sort of making a repertoire of the ways in which human rights abuses have been documented, and the different artifacts that have done this work, and how they have traveled to truth commissions, to justice processes, to memory practices. And we're now studying whether they are used in the way we teach about this period in the schools in Chile. If human rights documents are used or not, and trying to enhance its use in if you want pedagogy of memory. So we've done that genealogy, how they have traveled, and even to Argentina, to the Condor Operation trials. So how these artifacts travel across time and space. But that's all we've done. And there is a book around in Spanish and in English, Documenting Atrocities, called. Yeah. And I've got a question to Dana before I put myself in mute. I was thinking from the point of view of political violence in our continent is the use of hunger strikes. So if you have work doing the history of hunger, is there a chapter on hunger strikes? Because we have many in the continent. It was a form of resistance as this one we've been working on, the work of basically it's another artifact of resistance to in our case state violence. It was very important mean by the relatives of the disappeared in South America. So if you could say something about that, it would be lovely.
Thanks. No, I mean, this is something like I said, like it's so difficult to capture this sort of this form of violence. I mean, it's the case that hunger, starvation in particular, is the most important form of violence in the 20th century, and it's relatively, it's a footnote. Oh no, we'll be cut away. But yeah, no, I mean, I really appreciate those comments and sort of thinking about how to grasp this. And in particular, I just say that, understanding the extent of ethnic cleansing, genocidal ethnic cleansing in the American in the 1960s, I think is quite similar to the sorts of comments that you're making, and is not named as such. It's named in many ways. The war on hunger, the discovery of hunger in the United States. It's not named as a human rights abuse, and it is in fact very obviously genocidal. So that's, I mean, sort of how to capture that is just something but I really love the invitation to be playful, and I'm just, I'm learning so much from watching how all of you are mobilizing concepts to sort of unblock these processes.
Thank you so much, everyone. Meg, I had a question about dispossession and animals. I'll send an email because we're gonna be cut out. But I think we need to still keep thinking about it, and you're raising a beautiful idea that we all engage with, in which animals are maybe at the center of, like, you bring everything together when you talk about animals and landscape and territories. And all the dispossessions that are taking place are present in what you're mentioning, and it's so beautiful. And I do want to acknowledge that is happening there. And I wanted to think about that too. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. More power for us for thinking about wounds. and you'll get an email of gratitude, of course, and we'll see each other soon.
Sí. Gracias. Thank you, everyone.
Gracias a
Great
todos.
to meet
Un
you.
abrazo.
Thank you. Bye. Nice to
Dale,
meet
chao.
you.
Un abrazo.
Ciao.
Bye.